Summative Assessment Data Review. For this analysis, the team used consisted of just me, although our testing coordinator did assist in tracking down ELL GMAS scores, as I did not have access to those in the Georgia LDS platform. This data is important because it shows how well the students mastered the third grade math standards. The degree of mastery is beneficial when knowing how prepared students are when entering my class on the first day of school. These results play a critical role when placing students in their math class based on ability. This data will give us insights as to what level of mastery each student has achieved on the GMAS math. Beginning learner means that there's a substantial deficiency in a student's understanding. Developing learner means that the student has minor deficiencies that hopefully, with support, can be corrected the next school year. Proficient learner means that a student has mastered the standards and is on grade level. Finally, distinguished learner means that the student has fully mastered the standards and needs to be set up for enrichment the following school year. This data was accessed using the Georgia LDS platform. The students completed this assessment the previous year following all state guidelines to ensure that the data given is an accurate representation of each student's mastery level. As Bernhard explained, summative assessments are administered in such a way as to offer validity and reliability in their results. The data was chosen because in order to gain insight into a student's math ability on the first day, we need to see their level of math mastery based on state standards. Everything teachers do instruction-wise should be based on the state curriculum standards they are required to teach. Furthermore, not all teachers use the same level of rigor in their assessments. By using Math GMAS scores, we are provided with unbiased assessment data of a student's ability. This data also allows school leaders to monitor how effective their teachers are in their instructional practices. The class data shows how the students as a whole compare to both the county and the state scores. Yes, teachers are more than just their test scores. However, there should be some form of correlation between a teacher's instructional practices and the test scores of their class. Finally, this data was chosen due to the fact it helps make well-informed decisions. As Fisk explains, using the wrong data can lead to making the wrong decisions. I started with a pie chart to get an overall understanding of how many students scored in each of the achievement bands. I then created a chart with a corresponding bar graph to get a broad picture of how each student scored before diving deeper into the data. By sorting the scores from greatest to least, I was able to focus on the different subgroups. As we look at the data through the lens of school leadership, it is imperative that we focus on how each subgroup scores, as this is taken into consideration on CCRPI scores. Here we see how the gifted students scored on the Math GMAS. This will be used to decide enrichment activities when creating an action plan. Here we see that there is little to no correlation between being coded as an English language learner and their score on the Math GMAS. Next, we see two EIP students both scored in the beginning learner band. The general education students predominantly fell within the middle of the class, with the exception of one outlier. Finally, I wanted to focus on how the economically disadvantaged subgroup scored. Again, it is critical that this subgroup get extra attention as they, statistically speaking, are at a higher risk of not mastering state standards. The most glaring point the data brings up is that over half of the class is not on grade level. The EIP students need continued support as they are not on grade level and risk falling farther behind. Even though the ELL students were not necessarily the lowest performers, their limited language skills still hindered them from doing as well as they could. The data supports the need to focus on the economically disadvantaged. The data clearly shows that there's a correlation between being economically disadvantaged and having a lower GMAT score. This by no means is a direct connection, yet it still needs to be a focus to assist these students. The data shows that there is a need for the gifted students to receive enrichment activities to even further their achievement. Another thing that comes to mind when analyzing this data is how differently analyzing summative data is to analyzing formative data. This data is much more final in nature. Even though the GMAS data can and is used to drive the instruction of my class this year, it provides more feedback on student mastery and much less about how effective the instructional strategies used were. This is in line with how Bernhardt defines summative assessments as, quote, bottom line to learning as related to established grade level standards. As I finished with my data dig, it became clear that it brought to light important trends on student mastery of the math standards, many of which I was not expecting. As Fisk tells us, it is important to consider finding things you may not be looking for when analyzing data. Since this data is from the previous year and is the result of an entire year of teaching, it is very difficult to know just how many, if any, gaps in instruction there were. One presumed gap in instruction is the gap between the terminology used during instruction and the terminology used on the test. There needs to be a focus on teaching testing terminology. This will assure that the students are properly prepared for the next GMAT assessment. The important part of this step is that it will benefit all students regardless of performance levels. This also is an appropriate time to provide language support to the English language learners. There needs to be time spent reteaching unmastered standards. Since math concepts build on one another, it is imperative that students be provided opportunities to relearn the unmastered standards. For students who have partially or fully mastered the standards, problem-based learning should be implemented to help strengthen those students' understanding, as well as provide them with real-world scenarios of how the concepts relate to their daily lives. When creating the action plan, it was important to think of what was feasible and most effective. As Fisk proposes, think of all the small steps involved when creating your action plan. What may seem like the best option can lead to time, financial, or personnel constraints. The first step of the action plan is to focus on the testing terminology. This step will benefit all students. As a result, it was prioritized. Next, reteaching needs to occur to close gaps. Students who are struggling need assistance to prevent them from falling even farther behind. To make this step as effective as possible, the use of visuals and manipulatives will be used. The English language learners need to have access to language supports so they can be successful despite the language barriers they face. Finally, the students who have mastered the standards still have room for growth. Unfortunately, many times these students get overlooked due to the fact they have already mastered the standards. We owe it to these students to provide them with the rigor they need to reach their full potential. These changes will be carried out during our remediation and enrichment times in small group settings. To evaluate the impact, as cheesy as it sounds, we use the rhyme reassess to ensure success.